And welcome everybody. I'm Jolene. I'm with the Missoula Public Library. And with me here is Yvonne Sorovacu with the Five Valleys Seed Library. So welcome to our seed saving class. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Yvonne to get started.
So I'm glad a lot of you can make it. This is a great turnout for this version of I've done this for the Seed Saving Library for a few years now, maybe 5 years. And it's always a lot of fun, but this is a new format for me. So I'm going to do my best and hopefully you'll get something out of it. And we'll have some examples along the way. I've brought a lot of pictures to share because I really want to illustrate what we're talking about. I usually do this in a garden. So usually I have access to plants that I can actually show you examples from. But I've tried to adapt it and hopefully it'll still be really helpful. And we're going to take 2, maybe 3 breaks throughout the presentation for me to just see what kind of questions you all have had and respond to them, hopefully answer some of your questions. So the first thing I'd like to say is if there's anything specific you'd like to get out of the workshop, like go ahead and use that chat box right now and go ahead and let me know. This is a pretty basic seed saving class. Like I'm not an expert. I've been doing this for a while. I do know enough to know what kind of questions I need to ask and what kind of techniques are out there if I do decide I want to save seed from a specific kind of plant in my garden. So that's really what I'm aiming to get everybody here today, is that kind of knowledge. So to take out any of the intimidation that might be there and just to give you the basic tools to let you know, like, here's how to get started. So that's what we're going to do today. Yeah, so we'll have a slideshow. And like I said, we'll take breaks for questions. And then at the end, we'll have more time. Oh, we got somebody from New York. Awesome. And yeah, that's so cool. That's the cool thing about the Zoom thing, is like, I have no idea where you all are watching this from. That's cool. So yeah, let's get started. I might be a little awkward here. And what I'm gonna do now is pop up my presentation. So you guys are gonna see slideshow come up on the screen. And Jolene will let me know if anything's not working right. So we're gonna talk a little bit, somebody mentioned in the chat about wanting to know about heirlooms. We'll talk a little bit about that. Saving heirlooms is pretty similar to saving other seed. We won't go too much into the history of it just because we have an hour. There's a lot to say about that. So basic seed saving. First off, why even save seed? People have all kinds of different reasons for wanting to save seed. And there's lots of food traditions all over the world. If you just look at this picture, you can see these are seeds that were started in many different parts of the globe. So some people do it because they want to save money. It's a lot cheaper to just save your seed from the year before. Some people do it because it's a family tradition. Maybe it's a plant that has a significance to their family and they want to, keep it going. It might have very specific traits that they've slowly been selecting for that are good for the part of the world they live in. So local tradition, right? There's local tradition. I know there's a lot of like native corn in Central and South America that is a big part of local traditions there. And feel free to write in the chat if there's specific reasons why you want to save seed. Food sovereignty, the idea of having control over your food source. Since the early 1900s, the number of seed varieties that exist in the world have dropped dramatically. And a lot of that has to do with the monopolization of the seed companies. There's way less seed companies out there now than there used to be. So there's a lot less varieties that are available out there, which also means that they're not necessarily adapted for the place you live. They may be adapted more for a characteristic that isn't so important to you as a home gardener. They might be selected for the fact that they can travel in a truck very far and not rot, or uniformity. They might not necessarily be selected because they're delicious, or because they look beautiful, or because they grow really quickly in a short growing season, like we experience in Montana, or I don't know what might be important for somebody in New York. Maybe growing with a few hours of daylight because you guys have so many tall buildings there. And somebody mentioned saving seeds that work well where we live, seeds that have learned how to thrive here. So yeah, so there's tons of reasons to get into it. And whatever your reason is, I'm glad you made it today. And it all starts with flowers. So we're going to talk, my background, I don't know if you read my bio, but it's definitely science-based. I studied biology. I worked in a botanical garden for a while. I studied environmental studies. So don't worry, we're not going to get too hung up on terminology or words. Just going to focus on the most important things. So we're going to talk a little bit about how flowers reproduce. So I want you to take a look at this picture of flower. The reason we term it that is because it has all of the reproductive organs in there. So everything you need to make a seed is contained in this flower image you see here. You'll see that there's an ovary at the very bottom there that contains the egg cells. Those are the things that actually turn into seeds. And you'll see the pistil coming up from it is the pistil and the stigma. And really the stigma is just like a really sticky part for the pollen to land, because the genetic material from the pollen needs to make its way down to the ovary. And you'll notice that there's a place on there to make pollen, which is the anther. So most flowers will have some variety of those basic parts there. The main thing to pay attention to is that, like humans, flowers have like sexed parts. And when I say that, I mean specifically like female produces ovaries and male produces with humans we call it sperm, with plants we call it pollen. So just strictly that terminology. So there's male and female parts of the plant, ovaries and anthers. And this is a perfect one. And I included some pictures on the side there because unlike humans, plants sometimes need help reproducing. We got different kinds of pollinators, and not every flower needs a pollinator, but a lot of them do, and you'll see some examples here. It ranges from some of our native bees, which are that blue one. Wasps are also pollinators. I didn't put honeybees on here because everybody's pretty familiar with honeybees. Flies even help pollinate. Sometimes the buzzing of their wings actually helps pollen disperse. And of course, butterflies and beetles. There's also wind pollinated crops. So anything that moves pollen from one place to another, it could even be a vibration that moves it. I've seen people who even pollinate flowers using an electric toothbrush just because that little buzzing makes the pollen move. And once the pollen gets moved from the anther to the stigma, once it gets into the ovule, I just have some examples here. I love these pictures. I love these pictures because they really get you to think about what's happening there, how the parts of the flower actually turn into the fruit, turn into the seed pod. So a tomato is a giant seed pod, essentially. And you can see, if you look at that picture on the left, where the ovules are, like essentially the rest of the flower, the petals there, once it gets fertilized, those petals fall away And that ovule and ovary, they just swell and turn into the tomato that we know and love to eat. Well, most of us. And then another example of a pea. So you can see on the pea where the stigma is, and with the pea, there's that pod, and you know, that's what we eat also. But every single one of those little peas inside the pod is a fertilized ovule. So it's just a good illustration. And once you know this, once you really think about plant reproduction, I swear to you, you will not, every time you go outside and you look at different flowers, you'll start noticing all these little structures. The reason we talk about this is because there's different kinds of flowers. I showed you the complete one. And how they make their ovules, it's going to affect how you save the seed. So that's why we go into all of this, because what technique you use will be based on how they reproduce. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize all of them. But these are examples of complete flowers. Now, when we say complete, you know, it has all the parts. And these ones are also self-pollinating. And a self-pollinating flower can actually just fertilize itself. So if you look at each one of these, inside of each of these flowers is the pollen and the ovules that it needs to make a seed. And I'm wondering if anybody recognizes any of these. It's so weird to not be able to hear your voices. But just shout out in the chat room if you recognize any of these ones. These are pretty common garden plants. Yep, there's definitely peas. So the peas are the ones that are on the bottom, and they are a complete flower. They're pretty easy to save seed from. Somebody else put a shout out for the tomato, which is correct. That's the one in the upper, I think for you it's the upper left. It's like a big star with a pointy thing in the middle. That is a tomato. So they are self-pollinating as well. And then the one on the right might be a little harder to identify. That is a lettuce flower. So most of us pick our lettuce before it gets to that point. But if you do let it go to seed, if you do let it flower, you'll see usually some kind of little tiny yellow flower like that. And each one, there's the lettuce flower is actually made of a bunch of tubes. Like each one of those little frills is like one flower, and each one of those will make a seed. So some can self-pollinate, others cannot. So these ones inside of each of these flowers is like the ovules and the pollen, all of the stuff. But for some reason, they can't pollinate themselves. So a lot of these plants need the help of pollinators. They need something to move pollen from one flower to another flower. So it can be on the same, you know, plant even, but they cannot fertilize themselves, these flowers. So the pollen needs to move from one to another. So I don't know if you guys recognize any of these. These might be a little harder. These are, if you look at that one in the upper right though, it might look a little similar to something you eat. And somebody guessed it, it is broccoli. So you can see those little florets. You know, when you eat a head of broccoli, it basically looks like a bunch of those little round florets. But if you let it grow and actually open up, each one of those little bumps on a broccoli head will turn into a little flower. And let's see, we got carrots. So carrots are fun. They're in the Umbelliferae family, and they're the ones that kind of look like a big, they're like an umbrella of white flowers, that one down on the bottom. And then to the left, we have cabbage. So that is a cabbage flower. They're fun. If you let them go, they just grow this giant stalk from the very middle of the cabbage, and they get these yellow flowers on them. So Those ones need help moving pollen from one flower to another. Then, those were the incomplete those are the complete flowers we just finished looking at. There's other flowers that are incomplete. And what that means is that the flower is either a male flower or a female flower, meaning that the flower either produces pollen or produces ovaries, doesn't produce both. So these ones are pretty easy to recognize. A lot of squash plants, are actually like this. You'll see female and male flowers, but they're on the same plant. And corn, you probably recognize the corn over there. Anybody who grew up near big fields of corn probably recognizes that little tassel that comes off the top. And corn is another one of those plants. It has the tassel and the silk on the same plant, but it needs the pollen to move between the two. And corn is actually wind pollinated. So yeah, wind pollinated. And then the squash usually has a lot of bees. I don't know if you guys see a lot of bees around your squash plants when they're growing. But next time you look at your squash plant, take a look at the base of the flower, and you'll see, like if you look at this picture, it's a really good illustration. More towards the top, that one doesn't have any kind of swelling at the base of the flower. That's the male flower. The flower on the bottom, you see that fruit, that's actually the ovary. That's the female flower. And clearly that's going to turn into a big zucchini in like 5 days. So that's a little bit more complicated even, because there's male and female. Then we have incomplete flowers that exist on completely separate plants. So a lot of variation in the plant world here. And maybe you recognize the plant on the left. It's one that bolts pretty easily, might even be going seed already in your garden this time of year. So that plant and the plant on the right, they do produce pollen. Like one plant will only produce pollen and another plant will only produce ovaries. Two separate individuals needed. And then, yeah, it is spinach. So Ethan was guessing that it's spinach, and it is. So spinach is one of those ones that like you need to have more than one plant if you want to save seed, for sure. And you might need more than that, because there's no guarantee that if you only have 2 plants, one will be male, one will be female. So make sure if you're going to grow spinach, you grow a bunch of it. And you guys probably recognize the one on the right. That's the kiwi. And you can see, if you look at the flower itself, it looks different. One of them clearly has a bundle of like sticky anthers in the middle. It has a lot of those white, thick anthers. And the other one just has the little pollen producing parts. So don't get too hung up on the words, but just know that like, because we have all this variation in how plants reproduce, it's going to affect how you save seed. And just know that that's something to pay attention to when you're looking up information for your plants. The next thing we're going to talk about, and yeah, there's going to be some Latin here, but don't worry. As long as you get the main idea here, you'll be doing great. So genetics for gardeners. Scientists, we divide stuff into groupings. We divide stuff according to taxonomy. And our garden plants are no different. We have a whole taxonomic grouping for them. And we do need to pay attention to it a little bit, just so we can get the right seeds. And this is actually important for people who want to save heirlooms, and for people who want to sort of develop their own strains of plant. And we'll talk about why in a minute. We have a tomato. It's in this big family called the Solanaceae. And within that family, there's a bunch of genus. And tomatoes are in the genus called Solanum. And there's other genuses in that giant family, and I have an example of them here. And you can see that they are really not very similar to tomatoes. So within the family, we have Mandragora, um, Datura, which is actually poisonous to eat, and petunias. They're all in that Solanaceae family. And of course, there's a lot of other genuses in that family too. Now, if you drill down and get a little more specific, so tomatoes are in the Solanaceae family. They're the genus Solanum, and they're the species Lycopersicum. There's other species that are within the genus Solanum, and they're still not very tomatoey. You'll recognize some familiar garden faces here, like the potato, which is in the Solanum genus, but is in the species Tuberosum. And you'll recognize the eggplant, which is also a Solanum, but is in the species Molongena. And then you'll see this other thing called the Interius, which I threw in there because it's totally not edible. I think that one's actually called the cockroach berry. So don't eat that one. But within the species Lycopersicum, which is all of those are going to be tomatoes, right? And we have a huge variety of tomatoes within that species. So you got sun golds, black prince, tigerella. I don't know, people could throw up, if you want to put in the chat box some of your favorite varieties. And they vary in size, they vary in color, they vary in flavor. Even the inside coloring varies on them. Their leaves look different. Some of them grow, some of them are more sprawling. Some of them are more disease resistant than others. So just a huge variety. And the important thing to know for seed savers is that if you're growing a sun gold right next to a black prince, the genetic material of those could mix. And if you save seed, say from your black prince tomato plant, and you put it in the ground next year, the black prince, it might have hybridized. And the reason that happens is because they're within the same species. So if you really want to save seed and have it be like the plant you had last year, you have to pay attention to whether things in that same species are growing in your area. It's not so much of an issue for some plants. Other plants, it is. So like the self-pollinating plants, actually, I'm going to skip back. The self-pollinating plants, they don't cross very easily. Other plants that are open pollinated that bees might use, that bees might be important for, they can get crossbred pretty easily. So you might end up with, if you plant that seed, get something totally strange next year. So know what is in the same species. It'll affect your seed saving techniques. I'm not going to go into specifics now, but just know that's something to pay attention to. Like I said, if you want, we call them true to type seeds. You want to make sure they're of the same species and the same variety. One thing that I have a little note here in the handout I gave you, one species that is a notorious crosser is within the Brassicaceae, so like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kale, those will all cross. Turnip and Chinese cabbage, those are all cross with each other. So because of this, somebody does have a question. If you get a hybrid, can you continue to consistently grow that kind if you save the seeds from the hybrid? So not really. So there's different things you can do with hybrids. The main thing is, so like I was saying, I'm going to go back here. So basically, for an example, let's say the tigerella and the sun gold cross, like the pollen from the tigerella ends up on the sun gold and pollinates those ovum, you're going to end up with a hybrid. And when you take the seed and plant it, so the genetic material, not to get too technical, is you're going to have so many different potentials for how that genetic material mixes. So when you put that seed in the ground, you could put in 10 seeds and get 10 plants, like 10 plants that are noticeably different from each other. And you could keep saving seed from those hybrids, you know, like over the years. Maybe you just decide, oh, this, out of the 10 plants, I'll save the seed from this one. You know, maybe you really liked the way it turned out. Maybe you really liked the flavor. However, because it's a hybrid, the seed you save from that plant might not even give you the same one, give you a tomato that was similar to the one that you love the flavor of so much. It takes a while to kind of stabilize the traits. So it's not that you can't grow something from it, although sometimes when you hybridize, you do get sterile seeds. But it's just that the traits won't be stable. So hopefully that answered your question. All right. So if you do want to have those stable traits, like if you have an heirloom and you want to make sure you're preserving the traits that heirloom has, there's lots of different techniques. And it, like I said, it varies depending on what kind of structure the flower has and how it pollinates. So I'm just going to go over, there's a few different ways to do it. So a few different ways to preserve those traits, make sure that you're getting like a true heirloom plant, something that's consistent with what you had the generation before. It varies for the plants, and this is where you're really going to need to use some resources that I give you at the end of this workshop. They're in your handout. So here's a table. One thing that people can do is isolate by distance. So say you have a bunch of different basils and you really want next year's basil to be similar to this year's basil, you'll have to separate them by at least 1,600 feet. Basil has tiny pollen. You'll notice that some of these you don't have to separate very far at all, like beans. And that's because beans have perfect flowers. And so it's really hard to like cross-pollinate them. So just know that that's a technique, isolating by distance. It's a little harder to do for home gardeners, unless you're in a very rural area, not close to any neighbors. You can isolate by timing. So I have an example here of a bunch of different lettuces. There's so many different varieties of lettuce, and they can all cross with each other. But say you're in a place where your neighbor is far away enough that their pollen isn't going to get on your lettuce, and but you have 3 different kinds and you want to save seed from each one of those. You can decide to grow one of those varieties early in the season so that it flowers, and none of the other lettuces are flowering around that time. You can grow another one mid-season and another one late season. And that way you're separating them by time so that they're not going to hybridize. You can use mechanical methods. So I have an example on the right there of, I believe that's carrot. It looks like carrot. So there's a big cage around it, right? It's a screen. It's not plastic. Never, ever, ever isolate anything with plastic. So let the air flow through. It probably needs a little bit of airflow to get in there. And they might have actually, for some plants, and this gets a little tricky, so this will be a bit of a more advanced technique. Some plants do need pollination, but then you can isolate them after you think they've been pollinated to prevent them from getting from their pollen maybe getting elsewhere, or from them getting, yeah, it's called alternate day caging. I'm not going to go into it too much. It's a little bit hard to explain. But on your left, you can see like that's a tomato plant. So tomatoes can cross. However, we do know they have perfect flowers that can pollinate themselves. So if you just put a gauze bag around a nice little bundle of tomato blossoms, then you'll make sure that you get seeds that give you what you want next year. So it's pretty simple. So it can vary a lot. Like the techniques can be pretty simple to more complicated. Some people even hand pollinate to make sure they get what they want. This is kind of fun because there's different techniques for hand pollinating. Basically, you're pretending you're a bee or some other pollinator, and you're doing that job. So in the top left, that's, I think, watermelon. And you can see that they've clipped off the pollen maker and they're rubbing it on the ovule making flower. You definitely don't want to do it in the reverse. You need to keep the flowers that have the ovules on the plant, because that's the thing that's going to make your seeds, is the ovule producing part. So some people like to use paintbrushes. And then once you've done it, you do want to kind of close that blossom up. And so I have an example down there. And this one with the squash flowers on the bottom, you'll see that one of them is female and one of them is male. And the reason they taped off the male one is because bees love squash flowers. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a bee as it's going around its day, but it has these just like sacks of pollen on its legs, and it has pollen all over its little bee hairs. So if it's, you know, hopping around from flower to flower, it's, you know, lands on one flower, then lands on another one, it's going to drop some of that pollen. So the reason they have the male squash flower taped up is so that the pollen inside of that squash flower doesn't get contaminated. So they know that it's just the pollen that that one flower made. The reason the female one is taped up is so that, you know, it's only receiving pollen that we put there, that we moved there from them. And somebody said, when do you take, oh, that's a good question. When do you take the bag off the tomato flowers? So in that previous slide, right, there's this here, this white bag on the tomato plant, and it's on the flowers to prevent cross-pollination. And the way you know that something's been pollinated and it's okay to take the bag off is the fruit will start to form. Because that means those ovules have been fertilized and they're starting to turn into seeds. I'll show you an example in a minute here of something I plucked from my own garden. And yeah, so basically when you see those tiny little green tomatoes forming, and also the blossoms usually fall off. So like the flowers in your garden, you'll see them kind of dry up, kind of wilt and fall off. That should only happen if your plant is healthy after all of that pollination has happened and the ovules have started to grow. So blossoms dry up, wither, fall off, the ovules swell. It's really funny. My boyfriend, when he'd see that happen sometimes, he was like, "What happened? Is the plant dying?" I was like, no, it's okay. That's what it's supposed to do. And let's see. Let me pause just for a minute. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to show you something, and I kind of want to see your faces. Hi. I want to show you guys something from my garden. So somebody was asking, when do you know? I'm going to show myself view, so just so I can make sure you see this. Okay. So does anybody recognize maybe you have some of these growing near you. The flower's a little bit dried up. So yeah, that's an iris, totally. So, right, see, this is the flower and it's done. And it still hasn't fallen off, but down at the base, I'm gonna peel this away so you can see it a little better. So down here, these things I'm peeling away are called the sepals. They usually like protect the ovary. But see that swelling at the base there? So this is the ovary. So the pollen like landed on the iris and like traveled down into these ovaries. So now the flower's done its job. So, you know, usually it falls off at some point. I don't know if there's any eggs in here yet. I bet you there's not. Oh, there are, but I have no idea if you can see this. So you kind of see a little area in there. Maybe it's hard to see. You can kind of see the seeds starting to form. So when you see like this part start to swell up on a plant, when the blossoms start to fall away, that's when you know it's been pollinated. So I always like having examples. So it'd be really cool if we were in a garden together. I could show you all kinds of stuff. Let's see. How do you tell male from female blossoms? Let's see. I'm going to pull. So not all plants have male or female blossoms. Like in the iris that I just showed you, like the iris is a complete flower. It makes both pollen and ovules. So this one is both. It's male and female. Okay. On some plants, they make only male flowers, only female flowers. And I think I did show you that picture of the squash. I'm going to show you the picture of the squash plant again. Okay. So see on this picture of the squash blossoms, there's that swelling at the base. That is, so that right there is the female one, the one with the swelling. This one is the male. And it's different for different plants. So really you just have to get familiar with the plants. Once you have the seed, you need to know, how to save it, how to make sure it's in good condition for putting in your envelope or jar. Based on the different plants, you have different options for saving them. Most importantly, you need to know when is the time to save them. You don't want to pick them too early, because if you pick them too early, it's like a premature baby. It's not ready. It's not ready to come out and be on its own. So make sure that you let your plants get really ripe. And if you want to save seeds from a zucchini, what that means is you're going to have to let that zucchini get gigantic, like bigger than you would even consider eating. You need to let that stuff get to full maturity. With peppers, like here in the corner here, you want those peppers to get to their full color. So most peppers will start green and then go through some color stages. Some of them go through 2 color stages. Some of them go through 3. You want to make sure that they've like ripened all the way. So, maybe there's something you would normally eat when it's smaller, like peas or beans. You don't want them to get too big, and you don't want them to get too big to eat. But to save seed from, you're going to have to let them get really big and stringy and let them dry out on the vine. And somebody asked, can they get too mature? Not really. Yeah, they can't really get too mature, because once they've turned into a seed, they're not really going to do anything else. They're just waiting for next season. So the one thing that can happen if you leave them on the plant too long is that they can mildew or get affected by the weather. So you don't want them to mold. Like you don't want to leave them there so long that they'll get moldy. Um, but you do want to leave them there long enough that you know that the process is done, that the seed has matured. So this is an example of, this picture on the left, we got a zucchini. And honestly, it's not a great picture because that probably should have matured a little bit longer. Like that's still within eating range. But you can see what they did to have to process it, that they scooped out all the seeds and then, they put them in a colander. Wet processing basically means it's a seed that you need to like wash off, and that is usually pretty moist when it's still in the plant. So you got to wash it off and then let it dry. So the ones on the bottom right hand corner there, those are nice and dry. And you don't need to have any special equipment to do this, but you do want to make sure that you have a good place to dry them. You don't want the temperature to be anywhere above 96 degrees. And, a window screen works great. Sometimes you'll have to experiment because some seeds can get kind of sticky. Like I once dried some seeds on paper and then the paper totally stuck to them. It wasn't a deal breaker, I could still plant the seeds. Like they just had paper stuck to them. But yeah, so some materials are a little bit better than others. Window screen works pretty good because you get that good airflow. You don't want them to mold while they're drying out. You can use a fan blowing on them to help speed it up. Just don't get them hot. And make sure to keep them out of the sun. The main things for processing them are like, don't let them get too hot. So those are all examples of ones you wet process. And then there's also ones you dry process. These are pretty easy. You might recognize some of these. I mean, the beans, right? Beans are fun. They're pretty easy to save seed from. And, the one on the left, that one is just ready. The one in the middle, like clearly that's pretty mature. The one on the right, I mean, you can tell it's ready because the skin, that pod is all dry. The picture in the middle is actually kale. So I don't know if any of you have let your kale go to seed, but you can see those pods there and notice how some of them are still green. You don't want to take the seed from those, but there's other ones that have gotten a little drier. The color has changed. Probably they crackle in your hands. So those ones would be ready to save seeds from. And then you probably recognize the bottom one. That's just a sunflower. So same thing. You want to make sure it's nice and dry. Just got to get to it before the birds do. And when you save, don't be too picky. You might want to save from more than one plant. Just you have that a little bit of genetic variation there. As long as you have you'll have the traits you want. Aside from the genetics that determine those traits, there's going to be a little bit of variation, and you do want to preserve that. Don't be too picky. Don't save from sick plants. You don't want to pick these pods from a plant that has been really sick throughout the season. You want to pick from ones that have grown really well, been healthy in your plot, because otherwise you can, and somebody asked this earlier about like seeds carrying blight or disease. Seeds can carry disease. So you don't want to save seed from a plant that's been sick. Also, like if you know that you have this one plant slated for saving seed, you're like, oh, I really want to save from that one. It might be hard to remember which one you decided on. So some people like to mark them with ribbons, put a little something on the plant to remind them that that's the one they want to save from. So dry processing is pretty easy. Like I said, main thing is making sure it's mature. With dry processing, there's also, sometimes this process of threshing and winnowing to get that coating off. There's usually a coating on the outside of the seeds, like the bean pods, or some papery covering. It's not necessary to save seed, it can cut down on like mildew or rotting problems potentially. We don't have to worry about that too much in Montana because it's very dry, but if you're from somewhere else in the country, that moisture can be an issue. And so threshing is like kind of busting up that coating to get it off. Then winnowing is the process of removing that chaff from the seed. And there's lots of different techniques. I'm just going to mention a few that people use. Some people like to use screens. So basically you start with a really big screen and then slowly work your way down to smaller screens. You get the seed through there and hopefully the chaff stays in the screen. The seeds fall through it. Clearly that only works with pretty small seeds. There's also the idea of like using wind or like a fan to help blow off the chaff. In the picture there, somebody is pouring the seed down from a container into another bucket, and they put a towel in there because the seeds will bounce out. I've tried this before. And the idea is that the wind, the moving air, will blow the chaff away because it's pretty light, and then you'll just have your seed in that bucket. The bottom picture, I actually usually do this one, and I've done it with seeds very similar to the one in the picture, is if you just put it in a bowl, you just stir it a little bit, you just stir it around, and usually what happens is all of the fluffy stuff comes to the top. The heavier stuff, the seeds will go to the bottom, and then you can just like brush off or kind of just blow away the chaff. So if you do want to winnow, just know there's different techniques out there. There's some pretty fun videos of people trying out different techniques. And this in the bowl, I think that's kale or mustard. It's probably some kind of mustard. It looks like a brassica type seed. The one in the upper right is probably, it's a kind of grain. I'm not sure exactly which one. And this one is really fun. So some seeds, you know, there's the wet processing where you have to like rinse stuff off, the dry processing, and then fermentation processing. Has anybody ever tried their hand at this before? If you have, just a holler out there. But these, you need a little bit of help from fungus. So this is an example of somebody saving tomato seed. All those different jars are different varieties of tomatoes. And if you ever looked at a tomato seed, you'll notice it has that little capsule, that little like jelly-like capsule around the seed. And it protects the seed. It does a lot of important things for the seed. But when it comes time to plant it, it can prevent it from sprouting. So you want to get that little capsule off of the tomato seed before you save it. Also, it's really sticky and weird to save. So I can't think of a lot of other seeds that you have to do this with. I know they're out there. I just haven't worked with them. But tomatoes are notorious for this. You have to put them in a jar, put a little bit of water in, and then you just let it mold. And it might make you nervous. You might think, oh my gosh, this mold is going to kill the seeds, but it won't. You just wait for that to form on the top. And usually it doesn't take too long, you know, a few days, maybe a week. And once you see that forming, you'll finally wash it off, you know. You can just like pour them into a little tiny little sieve, run some water over and wash everything off. And then you just dry them like you would in the wet processing. But just know that some seeds need that extra help. And then what do you do with all your beautiful seeds that you have? You want to make sure that they stay good for next year. And the rules of thumb for seeds are you need them to be dry, cool, pest-free, and labeled. Those are the most important things for saving them. When we say dry, they should snap and not bend. So for an example, you know, you'll see that picture on the right-hand side. It's probably a cucumber seed, maybe that's the bigger one. I'm not sure what that smaller one is, But like if they're small and you can kind of like smash them, like mush them, they're definitely too wet. If they're bigger, like that cucumber seed, and they just bend, like it looks like they tried to bend that one, you can see it's just kind of like creased, then it's too wet. It needs to be dry. So like bigger seeds, they should just snap if you try to bend them, you know, if you put pressure on them. And little seeds should shatter instead of just mushing. So that's a non-scientific test for that, but pretty reliable. Um, so, you know, when you're drying them, I mentioned this earlier, you want to make sure that it's not too hot when they're drying. You want to make sure that pests can't get to them, because lots of animals really love to eat seeds because they're so full of nutrition and good things. So make sure you dry them in a place they can't get to. Airflow is really good to get them to their dry state. You want it to be cool when they're stored. So when you're drying it, you want it to be below 96 degrees. You know, you don't want it to be too hot. Some people like to use their oven to dry seeds, but you need to be extremely careful with that because, like I said, can't be too hot. I know that, you know, there's also people who have dehydrators. Dehydrators usually get too hot too. So just make sure you know what temperature your equipment gets to before you decide to use it. And it's not necessary to use equipment. Cool. So when you store it, it's kind of like, storing a lot of things, 40 to 60 degrees. It's just in that sweet spot there where it's not freezing, because freezing temperatures can cause ice crystals to form in seeds, which can destroy them. You might have heard of that place Svalbard, which is a giant seed library, a giant seed storage facility, and they freeze things. But they also have the equipment to test the moisture that's in each seed. As long as the moisture is pretty far down, I can't remember the percentage, you can freeze it, but it's really hard for home gardeners to get that precisely. So for most of us, we're just gonna wanna stick it in, like, even the refrigerator could work, or just a cool space in your house, somewhere that doesn't get too hot. Yeah, like don't put it in the attic, don't put it in the shed. Pest-free, keep those animals out, and then labeled. Whatever info you want. I just have an example here from a Seed Exchange library. The main thing is make sure it has the information you want, anything that's helpful for you. So just take a minute to think about that before you make the label. Clearly, you'll want to know the name. Some people like writing down where they got it from. Maybe, you know, the grower's name was actually from a friend. You want to know the year that it was harvested. That is very important information that you should always write down, because seeds do only have they have a limited lifespan. So they can, in the handout I gave you, it mentions this, different seeds stay good for longer or shorter times. So for example, like lettuce seeds usually stay good for about 3 years. Tomatoes can stay viable. They'll grow something for even longer than that. You can keep them for more than 3 years. I often keep stuff for quite a few years, and I'll just plant, you know, like if I've had a bunch of tomato seeds for like 5 years, I'll just make sure I plant a bunch of those seeds out because I know a smaller percentage of them will sprout. So yeah, make sure you put down the year harvested, where it was from, and then maybe like what traits you selected for. I think that's all I had on here. And oh, when you store them, yeah, I'm gonna end this slideshow. When you store them, you just need to put them in something that will keep them nice and dry, right? You spent all that time trying to get them nice and dry. So make sure that you put them in something that keeps them that way. In Montana, I don't have to worry about it so much. So this is what I put my seeds in. We don't get very humid here. If I was living in like, okay, where I moved here from, Virginia, this would be a canning jar. I would want to have something that keeps the moist air from getting in. So yeah, like a canning jar or something else that'll keep that humid air from getting in. But this is just metal, so like I know no insects, no mice are going to get in here. Generally moth free. Moths also really like seeds. And then I just have my packets. And sometimes I'm really lazy with how I label stuff. That's all I did for this one. So the most important stuff is on there, right? And it's just an envelope that has tape on it. You don't need to get fancy. And I want to give time for you all to ask some questions. I know we're right at 12 o'clock, and this is scheduled to go to 12. We can, if you raise your hand, we're just going to take you off of the, we can unmute you. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. We'll do it that way instead of doing the chat for the last few minutes. For folks who are here from different parts of the country, just know there's also like a really good source for a lot of folks is like regional seed companies. So if you're really interested in heirloom seeds and what we call open pollinated seeds, the kind that you can save seed from easily, see if there's a regional seed company, like one that's like based in New England, or one that's based in like the Mid-Atlantic, or one that's based in, you know, the Pacific Northwest. Check them out for sure.
Okay. As part of the Five Valley Seed Library, when we give out seeds, we don't do any squashes because we just assume they've cross-pollinated and wouldn't be true. Other plants that we should be avoiding because we're receiving just general seeds from the public and then redistributing them?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'd be hesitant to say like don't take these, because like some people, they put a lot of effort into researching, and I mean, it's just hard to know what kind of background and information somebody's coming out with. I mean, if you look at that table of seeds that cross easily, like the ones that need huge pollination, like isolation distances, those are generally ones that would be really hard for home gardeners to save seed from. So if you can look at a table like that, that like breaks down the isolation distance, that's going to be a good indicator of what'll be harder for home gardeners to save.
Oh, I was just going to say, what about using the silica to keep things dry? Do you know?
Yeah.
Silica packets?
Yeah, that's a thing.
Okay.
That's totally a thing. So, and there are, as soon as we get the handout to you folks, there's places that do sell them specifically for keeping your seeds dry. And I know, I moved here from the East. I know it gets humid, really humid. So, yeah, because like if you're saving seed in August or September, right? The ambient air might be so moist that it's hard for you to get it down to that dryness.
Yes.
So there are places like seed companies, seed saving organizations, that they do sell those little silica packets, and you can throw them in there to like get the moisture down. You know, like you would throw it in the jar with your seed and just seal it. So yeah, that you can do that. And there are sources specifically for seed savers.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, I asked that question about hybrid seeds.
Oh yeah.
You can't use those again, can you?
Well, we talked about this a little bit, but the problem with hybrid seeds is who knows what you'll get when you plant them.
Okay.
Like the hybrids that they sell in this, you know, in catalogs and stuff, like those are very controlled, like, and they've done tons of like trial runs with them. They're crossing two very specific parent plants to produce the hybrid that you're going to get, and they know that it works. As a home gardener, like you can save seed that's, you know, been hybridized, and you can plant it, but you just don't know what you're going to get.
So it might be the hybrid, or it might be one of the parents.
Well, It's going to be a genetic mix of whatever was in the two parent plants,
Okay.
right? It's not going to be completely identical.
Okay. That's what I thought.
Generally, it's not going to be completely identical to the parent plant. It'd be really hard for that to happen. Sometimes they're even sterile, like you'll plant it and it won't grow well. Sometimes like you could take like a hybridized tomato seed, and let's say on tomato plants, we want to eat the fruit, right? But what if the way that it hybridized, the plant that's growing from your seed doesn't even produce fruit, you know, like, or produces a tiny little fruit.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You can too. I mean, it can be fun to play with. Like some people do play with that. It's just that you kind of need a lot of space and time to like play with those hybridized seeds to get something that's predictable again. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Oh, could I ask one more question,
Sure.
Yvonne?
Yeah.
F1. I know it's not a hybrid, but it's not. I've seen it on seed packs. Do you know what that? Or is it too long to answer?
No, I mean, like, I'm a little fuzzy on it. I know it's like, it's about genetic generations.
Mm-hmm.
So like an F1 is a specific generation. Like
Okay.
when you cross something, I think it's the first, it's like you take the two parent plants and then that next generation is the F1. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Nicole is confirming that for me. It's like the first generation. Is what that
all
means.
right. So
Yeah.
if you save seeds from there, you would still get the straight plant, not like the hybrid where you wouldn't know. If you save seeds from an F1,
So like an F1, that's a term, Nicole, if I'm wrong, correct me, because I know you've done a lot of, Nicole is on here, and I know she's done a lot of like, she's been interested in how you hybridize stuff and playing with that. But so the two parents, right? Let's say this is a sun gold and this is a black crim.
Okay.
And if the pollen from this one pollinates the ovules in this one,
mm-hmm.
this one will make seeds, right? This is the parent. And those seeds now will be the F1 generation. They will grow the F1 generation. However, that F1, when it grows, it could be just like the parent. It could be like similar to the parents, but chances are it's not going to be because it's a hybrid.
Okay.
If you keep saving seed from that, I think that's when you move into the F2 and F3 generations. It's like a term that plant hybridizers use.
Okay.
To kind of like track the generational level. I don't know if that clarified anything.
It does. I wanted to know.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Allison mentioned that. So like, yeah. So the F2s are like if you save seeds from the F1s.
Oh, all right.
Right? Yeah.
So you won't know what you get. There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And it's still kind of like, what are you going to get? We don't know because it's a hybrid.
Something to play around. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, everyone.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. Well, unless we have any questions, I think we're going to wrap it up.
And thank you so much, Yvonne. Thank you. This was great. Thanks for everyone for coming on behalf of Missoula Public Library and the Five Valley Seed Library. I can't wait to start saving seeds.
I know, it'll be so fun. And now next time you go out, every time you see a flower, it's going to be on your brain. I promise. Every time you see one of these, you're going to be like, where are the seeds? So happy collecting. Thanks, everyone.